Does the global Sukuk market face a difficult year in 2018? That's the theme of today's edition of Inside AB. I'm Jeremy Lawrence, and to talk about this subject, I'm joined by Eddie Taylor. So, Eddie, report this week by Mohammed Damak, Global Ratings Head of Islamic Finance at S&P. He's kind of a bit down on the prospects for 2018.
I think it's going to be a softer year. I think that 2017 was a really big year for it. So I think he's just kind of looking at the numbers this year and thinking, for a number of reasons, there's probably going to be less Sukuk issuance this year, whether that's from sovereign wealth funds, whether from countries or whether from large regional institutions. So it's not like a completely falling off a cliff, but it's not going to have the same sort of big numbers that we saw last year.
So we went from $85 billion in 2016 to 95 in 2017. He's predicting 70 to 80 billion.
Still big numbers, to be fair, but
well,
just
again,
when you compare it to 2017, it is a little bit of a reduction.
Yeah, before we go to the downturn, let's look at the rise in Sukuk. Firstly, the GCCs were borrowing huge amounts.
Yeah, I mean, this was just basically a way that countries and companies could go to the international bond market and raise huge amounts of money based on future earnings of their own. You know, it's essentially they're selling their debt, really. Saudi Arabia launched a $9 billion Sukuk last year, which was the biggest ever. Yeah. And it's a way of kind of like, generating liquid assets, either in a country sense to kind of balance the books, which is what the likes of Bahrain and Saudi were needing to do as the oil price declined. But it was also a way of companies like Emirates went onto the bond market last year in order to kind of, finance investment. Pay for things that that they wanted doing on large scales that they weren't able to get regular financing for.
And in an era of cheap money, it made a lot of sense.
It made a lot of sense.
And this is interesting, isn't it? Globally, the market for Sukuk has been growing as well.
Yeah, this isn't the traditional big players. You think of the Islamic finance world as being very much centred around where we are in the GCC and also Indonesia. But what was interesting was Hong Kong issued an Islamic finance bond last year. Nigeria issued its first. Britain issued one in 2014, its first, and that's going to mature this year. And there's talk of them being able to go back to the market and issue another one in 2018. So it's quite an interesting time.
Okay, so a real growing market. And if we just run through some more reasons for these, we said, haven't we, good liquidity conditions we've had in the GCC and everywhere else. I think this is an interesting point though, isn't it? That there's a desire as well to develop these industries.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that going back to the liquidity point, interest rates and sort of money was cheap, wasn't it? So I think a lot of people were buying up these debts because they just wanted better returns for them. They could actually get better value from acquiring debt from this part of the world. But yeah, as you say, it's all about sort of maybe getting Sharia compliance in their own financial institutions because there is a market to be had there.
Yeah. Okay, so if we go back to this 2018 outlook by Mohammed Damak, he thinks it's going to decline to between 70 and 80 billion, down from 95, did we say? Yeah. Despite there is still a strong need for raising finance. So if we run through some of the reasons why.
Several reasons why. There's just less money about. I mean, we've been looking at kind of the wobbles on the stock market, and that's been driven by interest rates rising. And I think that's one of the primary drivers. There's just less liquidity in the market. Quantitative easing has been pulled back. You've got the geopolitical situation in the Gulf, particularly, perhaps it isn't as kind of as stable as perhaps the international markets would like. It's always been a bastion of stability, this part of the world, and I think the issue with Qatar has maybe sort of taken that off the table a little bit. So all of these reasons are kind of like why the market issuance won't be as big this year.
Okay, and it says as well slow progress on the standardization of Islamic finance products, which I think we'll come back to in a minute. Okay. Upsides to that decline, though, liquidity conditions in the GCC countries improved last year, as in oil prices went up primarily. So there's going to be more money around in that sense.
Yeah, and Saudi Arabian banks particularly were able to kind of, their balance sheets look much better, the liquidity in Saudi Arabian banks particularly, as the oil price rose towards the back end of last year. So the Sukuk issuance, actually, the decline might be seen as, that's kind of a negative thing, but it's actually a sign of a slightly more robust financial picture for the region.
And if the banks aren't lending, they might shift to the capital market as well, which would be interesting. Going back to the nervousness about geopolitical situations, though, Saudi's power structure and the changes that we've seen in the social reform program, actually, I think Damak said that in the sort of more medium term, investors will be inspired to have more confidence. So that could That could be
Yeah, I
one of the
think
upsides.
as private sector is more empowered in places like Saudi Arabia, as more sections of the economy actually are contributing, I think, again, as you say, that actually might make it a more attractive place to invest in the future.
Okay. This comes back to what we were saying about the legislation standardization. It's a big thing. Accounting and Auditing Organization for the Islamic Finance Institutions and the Islamic Financial Service Board issued new standards in 2017 to smooth this process of Sukuk issuance. So there are new sort of standards coming to the market.
There are, although not many people can agree on them, and some people don't think we need them, and other people do think we need them. So it's just, again, there's that slightly kind of like blurry picture of this.
Yeah, and then we've got the Sharia compliance issues again, which is where these things haven't all been worked out. Trend is likely to reduce the attractiveness of Sukuk due to legal complexity and higher costs at the moment. But again, we're working these things out, aren't we? I think that's Damak's point. Okay. Broadening the investor base to include retail investors of WAF money, which could lift Sukuk issuance. I think this is the interesting point here that Damak points to. We talked about some of the kind of the temporary sort of question marks about Islamic finance, but there's a wider point is that these Muslim endowments, they're generally not after profit maximization, but rather fulfillment of social objectives. So there's a bigger picture.
It's a means of distributing money. It's not actually the revenue generation part of it isn't actually that important. This is about the desire to spend money on good causes, on education, on social projects, and the capital return isn't something that's particularly important on there.
Okay, which again underpins the long-term validity of this. Okay, so the conclusion is that financing needs of core Islamic countries will remain relatively high in 2018. But as you mentioned, the tightening global liquidity, geopolitical risks, and a lack of standardization leads to an uncertain year for Sukuk globally.
Yeah, I think that's a fair conclusion from Mr. Damak, I'd say. Yeah, again, it's for so many different reasons, we're just going to see a tightening of the money supply, and that's going to naturally impact Sukuk issuance. But again, the reasons for it, the desire to invest, the desire for infrastructure spending, the desire for diversification of economies in this region remain. So, as we say, it's a decline, but it's by no means is the kind of the whole sector kind of ground to a halt.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Eddie Taylor. You've been watching Inside AB. Please do comment on anything you've heard today and get involved in the conversation. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and, of course, join us every weekday at 10 a.m. Thanks.